and welcome to day 3 of our IUCN UK Peatland Programme Conference. I am Olly Watts, I'm your chair for this first session, and I've been working on peatland policy at the RSPB for more than 25 years, and I'm also on the IUCN Peat Programme steering group. The theme for today is about change and transformation in economic uses of peatlands and peat. So it's all about shifting management from drained peatlands under intensive productive use to deliver wetter ways of farming, which is one of the 6 UK peatland strategy goals. And then later today, in the afternoon, we'll also be discussing peat in horticulture and in gardening. So essentially, we're moving, this today is about shifting from using peat in the various degraded states to using them in their natural wetland state. We focus on lowland agriculture, which of course is productive and profitable, but of course with the unacceptable environmental consequences in our era now of both a climate crisis and a nature crisis. And as we'll hear this morning, these lowland farmed areas are the biggest source of greenhouse gases from the UK's peatland. So we're looking to the future, a future for new products that thrive on wetland peat soils, maintaining farming livelihoods and generating new enterprises for UK agriculture and indeed for sustainable living in a sustainable society. Throughout the day, the sessions will provide an introduction to wetter ways of farming, including lucrative, innovative and achievable examples from across the globe. We will learn about greenhouse gas emissions from UK lowland peatlands. We will share examples of wetter ways of farming in action, including an introduction to wetland agriculture in the UK, developing a landscape vision at Stora Wildmoos, the transformation of agriculture, the need for transformation of agriculture in the UK, and examples of UK trials and a demonstration for climate-friendly building materials. We'll also explore the importance of sphagnum moss in the fight against climate change, with findings from the reintroduction of sphagnum both as peatland restoration and from carbon farming trials, and I hope also from looking at sphagnum as a horticultural medium too. And then later today, we look at peat in gardening and horticulture with perspectives from both industry and the diversity of solutions emerging from peat-free campaigning. So today, I think, is a really exciting day. It's all about change, innovation, doing things differently and doing things better for peatlands, which we've really exploited over the last several decades. Just before we move on to the speakers, excuse me, I think you're all used to questions in the Q&A button, please, and comments in the chat. So if you want questions, put them in the Q&A and do vote for the questions that if someone puts up a question, you think, yeah, I'm really keen on that one. We'll now move to our 3 speakers this morning, and first up is Hans Schutten. Hans is the programme head for climate smart land use at Wetlands International, and he leads its peatland programme at the global level. And his talk is lucrative, innovative and achievable. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. I'm Hans Schutten. I'm the Programme Head Climate Smart Land Use for Wetlands International, and I lead on our global peatland programme. In the next 10 minutes, I want to talk to you about sustainable peatland management, that it can be lucrative, innovative and achievable. So why are we talking about sustainable peatland management? A recent Ramsar report has shown that 50 million hectares globally of peatland have been drained. And they are emitting so much carbon that to be able to make a Paris Agreement and to curb climate change, we need to restore them by 2050. Let's bring this back to Scotland. Peat soils contain about 140 years worth of emissions of Scotland. The 1.7 million hectares of peat soils in Scotland, 80% of that is been damaged in a recent assessment. Scottish Government last year announced that 250,000 hectares of peatlands need to be restored by 2030. So there is a real need for sustainable peatland management, but it can't be done alone by government aid, and it needs to be integrated with the community, and it needs to be lucrative, so it's got a long-term sustainable way of doing it and longevity in that. So what do I mean by that, by lucrative, innovative and achievable? Let's grab another example. Let's jump to the States. Ocean spray started in 1930. Started in 1930 as a small group of farmers growing cranberries. That cranberry juice is now grown globally, and there are now 700 member growers growing the cranberries to go in the ocean spray juice. The group has got an annual revenue of about 2 billion in 2020. So growing cranberries on peatlands with high water tables, keeping the carbon in the soil and keeping a decent biodiversity is making real big money. So there is real good money to be made of growing cranberries on peatlands. Let's grab another example a bit closer by. On the right, you see the lovely midge. We all know and we all love our midge, and especially people that have been to Scotland and to our bogs know that on a nice, calm, wind-still summer's evening, you can't hardly sit around the peat bogs because you get stung by the midges. And they not only sting you, but they come by the thousands and they crawl and creep under your hair. I've had it myself, and it's absolutely horrible. Actually, if you go next to the peat bogs or on the peat bogs, there is a plant called bog myrtle or Miriam gale, which the extract of the leaves is a natural midge repellent. Even a global pharmaceutical company used, especially when I knew about that about 14 years ago, they used extracts from bog myrtle to go in their product called Skin So Soft, and it became a midge repellent, and a lot of people use that. I know they've changed the layout and the makeup of their products, but what I'm trying to say here is that bog myrtle and sustainable growing and management of bog myrtle from Scottish peat bogs can be a real important ingredient and can make good money into a product. And the Avon Group, as you see here, the Avon Group had an annual turnover on annual worldwide sales in 2019 of $5.6 billion. So this is not small. This is not, but this is real good money. But let's go a little bit back. Why are these things happening? Can it be achievable? Because we all also know that there are many ideas that have got a proof of concept. If they get to a proof of concept stage, then find it really difficult to upscale. Yeah, you might have a small idea, but upscaling becomes really difficult. But let's look at some examples that are from bottom up, why they were successful. Let's jump across to Indonesia. In Indonesia, over the last 5 years, we've been working with the Good Energies Foundation to develop sustainable business models, bottom-up, community-driven sustainable business models for peatlands that marry high water tables, sustainable produce, and maintenance of carbon and high biodiversity. So we developed and we provided seed funding for small community enterprises to actually develop their business model to market. On the left, you see vegetables being grown at high water tables in peatlands in Indonesia. And on the right, you see purun. Purun is a grass-like or reed grass-like plant that grows in high water tables in Indonesia. It's turned into baskets, it's turned into floor matting, and it's now being sold throughout the country. Interesting about the purun is that it requires high water tables, and the areas where it is grown were under threat of being drained and the produce being lost. So through the work that we did, funded by the Good Energy Foundations and our teams on the ground, we've been in contact with the Indonesian government, and we've been working with the regional government to ensure the areas where the purun grass is grown is protected. So we got protection of the areas where it's grown. That has created a stable supply of the purun grass for the local communities, and therefore an income, and at the same time a sustainable management of the peatland. So bottom-up approaches work. Let's jump back again to Scotland. development to a small startup that I came across recently. Succow is a material science company that makes planet-positive textiles. So what they do is actually actively healing damaged ecosystems through innovative material supply chains. Wow, that says a lot. But what does it actually mean? What they do is grab a feedstock, and either coming from Paludiculture, conservation farming or saline farming, and turn that into textiles that are being used in mainstream. One of the products is called Biopuff. And interestingly enough, they are also now using materials from Paludiculture. So it's not only bottom-up traditional products, such as purun and the vegetables grown, or the cranberries, or the midge repellent that we all knew about, but there is also the textile supply chain. And we all know that especially in the fashion industry, has got a huge environmental footprint. So creating textiles that are sustainably grown and sustainably manufactured and harvested from peatlands will provide income and provides long-term sustainable management. So there is a real good opportunities there. So what's actually happening there if we think about these examples that I've just shown? All of them had a strong concept. They're either rooted in tradition, such as the ones in Indonesia, or the berries, or even the one with Avon with the skin so soft, or they were innovative and they've been looking at what kind of products, what we can do with the plants and the species that are grown on peatlands, and how can we do that and how can we harvest that in a sustainable way. So they all had a strong concept. Then there was seed funding to prove the concept and bring it from and start expanding and developing that concept. In Indonesia, we used the Good Energies Foundation, and there's other examples of that as well. Interestingly enough as well is that our Indonesia example really clearly showed that government needs to be there to facilitate, to help this forward, to put the right framework around it to make sure that it works. Because we strongly believe, and what this all showed, and also what the cranberry juice shown, is that working with farming and farming communities long-term roots the sustainable management of the peatlands in the local communities. So the management and sustainable management of the peatlands far outlives any project that we can fund as governments or as NGOs. Lastly, what is important is blended finance, and we need to, when we go from upscale, from proof of concept to upscale, we need money, and that can come either from the product and from buying into the product, but now as well, and that's really interesting at this moment, can come from carbon financing, and there is a clear on the horizon, biodiversity benefits as well, and biodiversity money coming in. So it is a blended finance of product, carbon and biodiversity. So what I've shown you over the last 10 minutes, that the sustainable management of peatlands can be lucrative. Think about the cranberries and the avens and skin so soft. It can be innovative. Think about the Succows, and it can be sustainable. And think about the people in Indonesia. So I think there are huge opportunities here, and I think we can make this work. And I hope that over the rest of this session and the rest of the Peatland conference, you see that it can work and that we can do it together. So let's recover wetlands together.
Thank you, Hans. A really interesting start to the day with ideas that I'm sure many of us will not have seen before, and really showing the spread of opportunity that I hope we can develop during the day. Please do put your questions in the Q&A button too. We're looking a little thin at the moment. Next up is Jan Peters from the Griefswald Mire Centre, who's involved in various projects in conservation, restoration, sustainable use and Paludiculture of peatlands. He works on both German national processes and also international cooperation with a focus on Europe, involved in policy analyses at various levels. So Jan's going to talk adaptive management Paludicultures as a wetter ways of farming, overview and diversity. Jan.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. I'm happy that I was invited by the organizers today to give you a presentation on adaptive peatland management, paludicultures as wetter ways of farming. My name is Jan Peters from the Succow Foundation, partner in the Griefswald Mire Center, and I will give you an overview and show you the diversity of the practices. Peatland rewetting is important because emissions from drained peatlands are substantial. In the EU, peatlands cause emissions of 220 megaton CO2 equivalent per year, which is 5% of total greenhouse gas emissions in the EU. Germany is the largest emitter of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gases in the EU, followed by Finland, Poland, the UK, but also countries like Romania. Rewetting of peatlands reduce the CO2 source. So we need to adapt the agriculture to wet soil conditions with the water table at soil surface. Paludiculture is an adaptive way of management of peatlands to produce products, biomass from rewetted peatlands. For this, we have to set up new utilization chains. This can be with grasses, sedges, reed canary grass, reed cattail, peat mosses, sphagnum, wood, elder trees, sundew or other medical plants. And you see this whole variety of different techniques and practices which can be conducted. But most important for the economy are, of course, the products which can be made from this biomass. We have construction and insulation materials. We have fiber for paper and moldings, packaging materials. We can use it as bioenergy, but also more advanced technologies like biorefineries, phytomining, taking rare earth from cattail, for example, and sphagnum, to use that as a substitute for potting soil and substrates nowadays made with white peat. The products from paludiculture can be climate protective in 3 different ways. The carbon footprint of paludic insulation materials, for example, which we compared here in this graph with conventional stone wool or EPS foam techniques, materials, are the reduction of the soil emissions from the peatland itself when it's rewetted, the carbon storage in long life products like these insulation boards, which stay in the construction for many, many years, even decades, and the replacement of fossil resources and energy intensive products like mineral wool, foams, things like that. What is not even included here in this calculation is the potential new peat formation, which leads to soil sequestration in the future. But paludiculture is a terra incognita. You cannot buy these products at the moment at the market because these products need the development of the entire value chain. You need new techniques for crop production, new breeds, seeding techniques, maintaining the fields, harvesting. For this, you need specially adapted machinery, which you have seen on the previous slides, or here this excavator used for harvesting sphagnum. You need new products, which needs to be further developed. And you need a whole new infrastructure, logistic, to process the biomass and bring that to the end consumer. And for this, you need integrative value chain concepts, which needs to be newly developed. Nevertheless, we already have paludiculture projects in Europe. Here on this map, you see that they are well distributed over Central, Northern Europe, but also in the Eastern European part, we find some examples. And this is a list we made as an overview for different sites, which includes paludiculture on bogs and fens all over Europe, also traditional forms of paludiculture, wet meadow use or reed cutting in wet peatlands, and more modern, new, innovative practices. And if we calculate the area, we already have 8,400 hectares around, which is not much, but it's a good start from which we can. But we still see that paludiculture and the wetted sites are wet islands in a drained landscape and therefore very difficult to maintain. So the sites are mainly small scale and implemented and funded by research and development initiatives so far, not by private sector. The focus is very different between the countries. In Scandinavia, the main focus is on water purification. In Germany, Poland, management for conservation purposes, biodiversity. And in other areas, especially the sphagnum farming aspect, on substitution for growing media, substituting peat. But we also see an increasing gain of political interest at national and European level as nature-based solutions for tackle climate change. And we have a continual knowledge gain and dissemination, for example, at our conference, which happened this year in March, virtually on renewable resources from wet and re-wetted peatlands from the Griefswald Mire Center. So the question, can we grow, is largely answered. What we need to answer now is actually a question, for what can we use paludiculture at the end? How can we make a value chain out of it? So, for example, how can we make from the typha field construction materials, packaging, or via phytomining extract rare earth? We have, for example, if we have 35,000 hectares of typha, we can produce 10% of the insulation used in Germany at the moment. For sphagnum farming, peat substitutes, with 35,000 hectares sphagnum, we can replace 100% of the white peat demand in horticulture in Germany. Or insulation of the wet meadows, using for insulation paper, biochar, or platform chemicals, or energy. If we use 35,000 hectares of wet meadows, we can heat 100 heating plants with this. So the question is, can we sell the products? At the moment, we have quite a lot of challenges here. Paludiculture can, under similar conditions, not compete with drainage agriculture, because we have very high initial costs for farmers to change to paludiculture. We have a high risk for investment at farm scale, as the framework conditions, especially long-term ones, are not set yet. The regulations and laws are not adapted yet, so we have, under the current CAP, we have a loss of subsidies, we have restrictions of utilization, which comes with extra bureaucracy for the farmers due to, for example, conservation laws. And we have a ban of grassland conservation, although deeply drained grassland has no big benefit for the environment and for biodiversity. We have problem with land access for re-wetting, with the fragmented ownership structure, and the impact on neighboring sites, especially when we work in an environment which I showed before with wet islands in the drained landscape. And we have the obstacle of the common agriculture policy in the EU. I hope that the UK will make it better after Brexit. The negotiations this year can be actually seen as a lost chance to stop climate damaging subsidies for drainage-based peatlands utilizations, and gains are rather minor. So we definitely need a paradigm shift from drainage-focused land use to wet landscapes. What are the opportunities we see at the moment? So the payments for greenhouse gas mitigation, for example, via carbon farming initiatives and schemes. This can be a new role and image for peatland farmers to keep carbon in the ground. The bioeconomy. So we will see an upcoming demand for renewable raw materials, and customers will be willing to pay higher prices for that. So Paludiculture provides renewable resources with even negative emissions when rewetting is included in the final product. We have a unique structural characteristic of wetland plants and species, and especially because they grow under these rigid environmental conditions in wet peatlands. So we have to develop new markets for that. And we can learn from Indonesia, for example, where they have implemented large-scale rewetting. We need a political will for that. In Europe, we need to rewet 500,000 hectares per year until 2050 to reach the Paris Agreement targets. It's not about if, but how we get paludiculture into practice soon. So we need paludiculture. Thanks for your attention, and I'm looking forward for your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Jan, and a very, very interesting dive into a little bit more of the detail that's required from the broad scale opportunities that Hans outlined. Our third speaker this morning is Ross Morrison from the CEH, Centre for Ecology and Hydrology in the UK. Ross specialises in the monitoring of carbon and water balance from the land surface. He leads the UK CEH expanding network of eddy covariance flux towers across the UK, with peatlands as a central focus of his work, particularly lowland peatland environments and the East Anglian fens, quantifying the greenhouse gas emissions from the peatlands under different levels of management intensity towards finding out how we can change management to mitigate those greenhouse gas emissions. So Ross is going to talk overview of greenhouse gas emissions from UK lowland peatlands. Ross, over to you.
Okay, good morning. I hope you can see me. So I'm going to be talking about some of our work on greenhouse gas emissions from lowland peatlands in the UK, primarily focused on East Anglia. I'm going to start off by introducing some of the work we've been doing over the pandemic in expanding our monitoring network. I'm going to talk briefly about our peatland greenhouse gas synthesis. I will mention some of the mitigation experiments we're doing in East Anglia with DEFRA and also with the Great Fen project. And then finally, I'm going to talk a bit about work we're doing on some of our wasted agricultural peatlands in the fens. So just to start with, this slide here shows the what is the UK eddy covariance monitoring network as it stood before the pandemic. We had a reasonable amount of sites at this time. There's a broad, as you'd expect, there's a broad gradient with a lot of peatlands at the top, primarily run by my colleagues at Scotland at the James Schutten Institute and other partners. And then further south, we have a stronger focus on more managed peatlands, so grasslands and agricultural systems and so forth. So over the last 18 months, we've been growing a lot. We've added to our network, we've added a new agricultural flux tower in East Anglia with DEFRA. This is on a wasted peatland that's managed using what have been called regenerative agricultural management practices, so no-till and that kind of stuff. With Natural England and Great Fen, we've added a new grassland site. This is a grassland on deeper peat. We have added, with the bays, have provided funding for 2 new flux towers. Sorry, I should say that the dots are appearing on the map to the right-hand side of the screen to show you where they are. So we've added 2 new sites. This is an agricultural site in Doncaster. So we started to look at the Humberhead peatlands as well as a big focus on East Anglia, so agricultural sites. My colleague in Scotland, Rebecca Arts, she's been doing a lot of work to expand the net monitoring network up there with a real focus on some quite degraded habitats. I was lucky enough to go up to Harris and Lewis a couple of weeks ago, looking for some new sites up there. And then I'm very pleased to say that we've actually started to push the network beyond the mainland and out into Northern Ireland. So this is a first site that we've established there on a raised bog with funding from DERA. This is a new flux tower that's measuring carbon dioxide, water, and also methane on a restored raised bog called Ballynahomy Bog. And I'm also pleased to say that we've got extra funds now to expand this even more. So we're going to be looking at different types of peatland management in Northern Ireland as well, hopefully installing the sites by the end of this year. There's also other things coming along. There's a planned forest site in Dumfries and Galloway. We're looking at we have funds to install a new grassland site in Wales. And then, as I'm sure Chris Evans told you yesterday, we're also starting to look at peatlands and their role in greenhouse gas removal from the atmosphere. So we have 3 sites that will be established also in Doncaster. So the big news from the UK Ecovariance Network this year is we finally published our UK peatland flux synthesis. So this slide here shows you the sites as they were, I suppose, towards the end of last year. And these are all the data. So we collected all the peatland CO2 flux data, the CO2, the net ecosystem exchange data, measured at all the UK peatland sites. And in this graph, you can see broadly they go from bogs at the top, which function as net sinks for atmospheric carbon dioxide, through to the fens, which are also generally net sinks. And then we move into things like grasslands, which become net sources of CO2, and to the croplands, which are quite substantial sources of CO2. So what we did as part of this work is we took all of these annual flux data, we combined this. So this is the net ecosystem production. This is the amount of carbon dioxide that's being exchanged between the surface and the atmosphere. We looked at this in relation to effective water table depth. So this is the mean drainage depth. You can see quite a strong linear relationship between these 2 things. We looked at the same thing for annual methane fluxes, and we were able to develop a relationship that relates effective water table depth to net carbon greenhouse gas emissions. So based on this and some upscaling, we can estimate that globally, agricultural peatland emissions are about 0.8 gigatons of CO2 equivalents per hectare per year, or roughly equivalent to 1.6% of global greenhouse gas emissions. If we start to explore this scenario by moving up and down this curve, you can see that if you were in the slightly unrealistic scenario where you would be able to fully restore all peatlands, you can effectively reduce this to around about 0. But the slightly more realistic scenario, which would mean obviously not all peatlands are going to be restored. So just by halving the drainage intensity could go a long way to reducing the global CO2 emission. So based on this particular estimate, we think that by halving drainage intensity, you could potentially knock about 1% off global greenhouse gas emissions just by managing peatlands less intensively. This obviously assumes that agricultural production is going to continue to some degree, but obviously the practicality of these are quite challenging, particularly in relation to managing water. So going to the fens now, I think the most important thing to say when you start talking about the fens is this is an incredibly important landscape in the UK. This infographic was produced by the National Farmers Union a couple of years ago, really to highlight the role that this region plays in UK food production and food security. It is an incredibly productive region. It supports an incredibly valuable economy, and it also therefore supports a lot of livelihoods and all the rest of it. So a key aspect of this is that as you start to think about changing land use in East Anglia, we need to think that food production really at the moment is a central issue here. So the flip side of this is that, as we know, greenhouse gas emissions from drained peatlands can be quite substantial. So the UK, we estimate that at about 19 megatons of CO2 equivalent per year, 4% of our national greenhouse gas emissions total. And if we look at this, we can see that the vast majority of this comes from areas that are used for intensive agricultural production. So that is intensive agriculture, like say for crop production, but also for intensive grasslands. And these areas occupy less than 2% of the total, so they are making a really disproportionate impact to the overall greenhouse gas emission. The flip side to that is that they also offer a lot of potential for mitigating the large greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, and for those who are looking forward to seeing Chris giving a presentation today, not me, the flip side to the greenhouse gas emission is it also results in a progressive loss of the peat soil. And that is not really in anyone's best interest. It's not in the best interest of the climate, and it's also not in the best interests of the farming community who require, who and the economy that depends upon the peat soils in this region. So the question that we are often asked at the moment is how much greenhouse gas mitigation might be possible through things like Paludiculture, through things like restoration, or possibly through more dynamic water level management in peatlands. And so if I return to the graph that we produced from our peatland synthesis, what we can see is that for every 10 centimetre reduction in drainage, this increases CO2 emissions by about 3 tonnes of CO2 equivalents per hectare. Methane emissions, so methane being a more potent greenhouse gas, doesn't become an issue until the water level becomes quite close to the surface. So around about 25 centimetres, you can expect to see methane emissions start to contribute more. So in this graph, the green line represents the net emission of CO2. The red line represents the emission of methane, and the black line represents the balance between those things. And from this, we can see there is effectively a sweet spot based on this data that we've, which comes from the flux network, is that there is an optimal water table depth for greenhouse gas emission for mitigating greenhouse gas emissions at approximately 0 to 10 centimetres below the surface. And then we can see that because of methane, it is potentially possible to over-ret peatlands. So here we're talking about effective water table depth, so the mean position of water table depth throughout the year. And if you were to get that wet all year, then there would be some potentially large methane emissions, which could potentially offset the benefits of net carbon dioxide capture. So this is obviously an empirical relationship that we've developed from data. And being scientists, we want to go out into the real world and test this. So we've got a couple of experiments that we're looking at to look at this in the real world. The first of these is a Paludiculture trial. So this is based at the Great Fen project in East Anglia, waterworks project. I'm not going to go into the details of this because Kate Carver will give a talk about it later on. So what we're doing here, using a slightly different type of flux measurement technique, is measuring the CO2 and CH4 balance of sphagnum farming. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic, there hasn't been any sphagnum planted yet, although that is incoming. But this gave us the opportunity to do a water level manipulation experiment. So here we were just focusing on what happens to the peat if you shift the water levels up and down. So we were assuming, our hypothesis was that if we increase drainage depth, then CO2 emissions increase, and methane emissions decrease, and vice versa. So we are working on those data at the moment. And then this project will be extended, well, once the Paludiculture crops come, there's a new project called Peatland Progress that's going to aim to scale up from the Paludiculture plots to the larger scale that we'll be able to measure using the flux tower approach. We also have, I suppose, at the drier end of the scale, there is, so assuming that agriculture is going to continue to produce food in this region, we have an experiment that is funded by DEFRA, and using this skyline equipment here. This is a greenhouse gas flux chamber, and the idea here is that we're trying to explore what happens to the greenhouse gas emissions if we were to maintain the water levels at different depths. So we are going to look at a business as usual scenario. We're going to look at a medium water level, so that's raising water levels to about 60 centimetres from the surface. We're going to look at crop production using a high water level scenario, so about 30 centimetres from the top. And we're going to explore what happens if you use winter re-wetting, so maintaining the water level about 60 centimetres during the crop production phase and increasing that to a high level in the winter. So we're going to be measuring, we are measuring all three of the greenhouse gases at this site, so CO2, methane, and also nitrous oxide. And again, we're working on these data and we hope to present these quite soon. As the previous speakers were talking about, I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but there's many challenges, especially in a landscape like East Anglia, of moving from a drainage-based agricultural system towards a wetter system of peatland management. There's obviously hydrological challenges. How do you manage water levels? The previous speaker was talking about wet islands. There are agronomic challenges, so how to cultivate water-tolerant crops. The whole region is currently set up for drainage-based agricultural production. And then, of course, there's all the economic challenges, so particularly how to make the finances stack up. So what are the markets? Is there going to be support from this? And potentially, what do payments for carbon and for ecosystem services look like going forwards? Finally, I just want to highlight these projects that we have with Bays. So as I mentioned before, intensive agricultural production on peatlands is responsible for the largest proportion of greenhouse gas emissions from UK peatlands. But there is a slight bias in the data set. So in the past, because we were peatland scientists, we very much focused our efforts and our measurements on areas of deeper peat. But if you look at the map to the left here, it's become increasingly clear. So the black areas are deeper peat. In the Fenlands, the classification that seems to be in use is deep peat is over 1 metre, shallow peat is roughly 40 centimetres to 1 metre, and wasted peat, which actually is the largest area of by area in the region, is below 40 centimetres. So we previously hadn't addressed the emissions from the shallow peatlands, the wasted peatlands, and so there has been a concern, and rightly so, that we might be overestimating the emissions from peatlands just because we have primarily focused on the deep peat areas. So I'm pleased to say that with the funding from the BASE project, we have a project that is now looking at greenhouse gas emissions specifically from wasted peatlands. So we have 3 sites within the wasted peat subnetwork. We have 2 sites in East Anglia, Streatham, where they've been growing potatoes. Polybell is in Doncaster, and where they've been growing wheat. And then with DEFRA funding, we have a site at a place called Sawtree, where they've been growing peas. We're not quite there with the annual carbon dioxide budgets for these yet, but we will be very soon. So these graphs show the net ecosystem exchange of CO2. When these black lines are positive, these are daily carbon fluxes. It means the site is a net source of carbon. And when they're negative, that means that it's a net sink. So we will add this up. We'll combine this with estimates of the lateral carbon fluxes of the biomass and the seeds and so forth, and then that'll allow us to calculate the carbon budget. We're also measuring nitrous oxide emissions at 2 of these sites, so at Streatham and at the site up in Doncaster. So results from that should be available early next year. So that's it from me. Just to say, we are continuing to grow the peatland flux monitoring network in the UK. It's been an unprecedented growth during the pandemic. We have an incredible data set. We're starting to focus on we're starting to focus on a broader range of land uses that are specifically targeted to address some of the emerging science questions. We're working on Paludiculture. We're looking at optimising water management in agricultural landscapes and how that affects greenhouse gas fluxes. And we're also starting to look at CO2 and N2O from wasted agricultural peatlands. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Ross. So that really highlights why paludiculture is really, really important to get established across these lowland agricultural drained peatlands. I'd now like to come to the question and answer session, the Q&A session. So if we can have Ross and Jan back. I think we don't have Hans with us this morning, which is a shame. Puts a little bit more pressure on you two, Ross and Jan. And first of all, the questions are coming in. Do add some questions. Do vote on the questions that you would really like to be answered. And really, the top 2 are probably for Jan first, and actually are linked. And the first question is, how can we encourage the paradigm shift from centuries of conventional agriculture on peat soils to wetland farming? And then just to really nail that, what are the top 3 things that we need to upscale wetter ways of farming? So how do we get this paradigm shift moving?
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me well?
Yes, you're good.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, for the first point, I think the most important thing is actually to have more awareness on that, because still in the general public and also among farming communities, there's very little awareness on this point of peatlands, peatland drainage, and the emission attached to it, and actually the enormous emissions, which we just heard, which are really a very significant sector in the whole economy. I mean, in Germany, it's now in the national inventories, it's 7% of total emissions in a highly industrialized country like Germany. So we need to create more awareness on that among the common people, the general public, but also among farming communities, farmers, landowners, that there is really an issue which we have to tackle. And of course, with politicians, with policymakers, to then create governance systems which allows actually to scale up the system. And that's already touching upon the second questions. I think the most important thing, the top 1, is to develop the framework conditions, like the policy framework, in a way that you are not penalized like it is at the moment when you re-wet your peatland and plant alternative crops like reeds or sphagnum, which is now the case still in at least in the EU. I hope the UK will do it better now. And the second top two, I would say, is that, of course, the products will reach the markets, because at the moment it's all still very much in the niche. There is standardization, also harmonization of these standards is missing. We need certifications, for example, for these building materials, that they are fireproof, that they have a specific value of insulation, for example. All these things need some investments from private sector, but also supported by public subsidies, I guess, to really bring and initialize that to the markets. That is the second top priority, I would think. And the third priority is, again, the awareness by the customers, that they see the big advantage, not only in the product, but also in how they are produced, and that there are actually a lot of climate change mitigation and carbon storage and sequestering involved in the production of these products on the re-wetted peatlands. And that has to be made more clear, for example, also by labels which show these effects on the products, large-scale campaigns, making customers aware, so that the products are really bought and really can succeed on the markets. So this would be my top three to upscale paludiculture in Europe and globally.
Thank you, Jan. Ross, do you have anything to add to that, or should we go to the next question?
I don't have anything to add. I think next question.
Great. I will add one thing. I think having the greenhouse gas emissions in the national greenhouse gas inventory in England certainly has been a massive driver and particularly local councils taking up net zero targets. Certainly in Cambridgeshire, that's been a huge driver for getting some of the initiatives here. So I think that's really, really helpful. Related to that, you talked a little bit about product standards, Jan. Do we also need sustainability standards for growing these products?
Yes, sure. I mean, we really have to be aware and be cautious that we don't go the same way as industrialized agriculture goes in other areas. So we should not start to put a lot of manure and other nutrients on these sites, because it directly enters the water. Yeah, peatlands, wet peatlands have a direct connection to the hydrological system. And if we put too many of nutrients, if we also put pesticides, other things on there, we should not go this way. We should use this, the peatlands and also paludiculture as a nature-based solutions. And use the power of the landscape, because actually in fens, nutrients are accumulated, filtered out from the landscape, and in bogs, the sphagnum grows without any nutrients. That's the power of the sphagnum. So we should not go this way, that we want to adapt the production and the sites to the product, but other way around, that we use the sites in a way how they are productive and can be used.
So, with those standards, should they start from a global perspective, or are they more regional or even local? And is there any work starting on towards standards, particularly for paludiculture, which is a little bit different from drained agriculture?
Yeah, we were thinking about that in Germany. Actually, we are in contact to create a paludiculture label, which will also include such sustainability standards, of course. But at the moment, our first goal is first to develop the products and bring them to a market, and then think about the label in a parallel process. But we are not that far at the moment, and I think it's better to start from a seed perspective, like in one country, one region, and then scale it up later. Because starting from a global perspective, where you have many different peatland types, many different climatic conditions, and different products, I think that doesn't make sense.
That's really helpful. So very interested to see what you're developing in Germany, because I would imagine that that's probably pretty much replicable for the UK. And let's start all this Paludiculture off on the right foot, and we don't have to retrofit standards to it. This might be a question for you, Ross, because I think with your flux tower work, you'll obviously have been speaking to a lot of farmers. So what would you say to a farmer who firmly believes his role is to produce food? How do we help that paradigm shift? And do you think, are farmers resistant to this? Are they talking about importing food? How do we overcome that little problem?
I've spoken to many farmers who asked me this, and I mean, in East Anglia, most of the farmers who I speak to are very keen to do progressive things and to change. But the biggest barrier to it that they talk about is where are the markets? Where do I sell this? It's a massive food producing region, and most of the people there still want to produce food. So I mean, most of the a lot of them are very keen to diversify and try new things. A lot of them are keen to spread the risk and do lots of different things on their land. But it is, food production is still central. There's a big concern that there's going to be, all we'll do is offshore our emissions somewhere else by importing loads of food from some other production system. And culturally, a lot of them just want to keep producing food. That's what that region's about, really. It's the kind of breadbasket of the UK. So, I mean, I think that, and within that, many of the Paludiculture crops have got lots of great uses for bioenergy and fibres and that kind of stuff. But what seems to be lacking to me really is some sort of food replacement. So what could you grow that there was a market for and was kind of amenable to be grown in that region?
Thank you. And of course, there's a lot of discussion about dietary change to help climate change and so on and so forth at the moment. And I hope that these things can be joined together into a more holistic look at things. And the other aspect, of course, is the amount of food wastage that we have in the UK, which needs to be brought into this discussion. Do either of you have any comments on the Paludiculture equipment actually damaging the peat soil? Or is that a problem? Do we have the equipment? It just needs, getting in the farmer's hands, as it were.
Can I come? We not so much on the Paludiculture, but we do have this concern with the kind of optimised drainage thing. So the equipment is so part of the project that we are doing on the farmland with the optimised water level experiment is looking at what are the impacts on the peat soil. So we're going to go away and do a whole load of measurements on that. They haven't started yet due to delays for the pandemic, but we're going to look at the trafficability across sites and that sort of thing. So not so much for the Paludiculture, but I expect that I expect that at the Waterworks project, for example, this is something they'll be thinking about.
Mm-hmm. This might be one for you, Jan. How do we showcase the products of Paludiculture? Do we need a trade show or something like that, or to encourage big business to adopt and create the demand? And the breadth of range of this is staggering, actually. From insulation in coats to boards and food and so on and so forth. It's quite a diverse market, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And I think you have to go to where the business is. And this is mostly at these big business fairs. Like for construction materials, there are big fairs where all the new innovations are shown. And that's why we in Griefswald built this tiny house. I also showed that in my presentation. So that is a whole mobile tiny house, which is built just from Paludiculture materials, from the wood outside, the roofing from the reed, insulation materials from cattail, furnitures inside made from the boards made from thatches. All that stuff, and you just have to go where they are and show them and explain them the benefits. We need then also we need to have the facts and numbers ready, and that's what we are doing. And we see a lot of interest because also, for example, this construction business, they are now really suffering from the wood crisis. Prices are rising dramatically at the moment, so they are also looking for alternatives, and they know that they cannot take much more timber out of the forest, and that could be an alternative. And so this is the way we are going, also partnering with private sector, with businesses in different fields, and explain what it is.
Thank you. We've just about run out of time, and I think that's actually quite a good point to end on. So if I can thank all the speakers, Hans in absence, Jan and Ross, for very interesting presentations this morning. There are still quite a few questions, particularly on specific ones for Ross, I think, on some of the detail within your research, which I hope you can pick up during some of the chat sessions or offline. And we really absolutely await that information on the wasted peats with bated breath. And thank you very much indeed. Thank you for the questions. I think that's a great start to a morning of how we do change agriculture on these peatlands. We now have a break for 20 minutes, so please come back for the next session, which starts at 10:45. Thank you very much indeed.